The Halifax Explosion was one of the largest man-made explosions ever. It was 1/3 the size of Hiroshima and a full-scale disaster, completely destroying 1,600 homes and badly damaging another 12,000 buildings. It left 2,000 people dead and many thousands more injured.
There's no question that the explosion was a tragic moment in Halifax's history. But to me, what makes this story so much more unique and worth remembering is what happened next. How Halifax responded to the explosion, and how it continues to shape the city today.
So with that in mind, the title of this video is A Comprehensive Historical Analysis of Halifax's Post-Explosion Response and... yeah, that's a much better name.
Today we're going to be talking about this area here. You might know it as the Hydrostone district, with its trendy cafes, hipster families, and these really cool houses.
But what you might not know is that the Hydrostone district was actually an ambitious project to rehouse survivors of the Halifax explosion. It would involve ideas about the perfect community, and of course, controversy and drama, because what's a good story without that? Let's start from ground zero. After the explosion, the city of Halifax faced a pretty grim situation. Every building within a half-mile radius of the blast had been reduced to rubble. All in all, about 400 acres of land completely destroyed. But more importantly, 8,000 people were now homeless, and many of them injured. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, but this was in December, so of course there was a huge snowstorm on the night of the explosion. Like, talk about bad timing. Fortunately, a lot of money was pouring into Halifax to help the city recover from the explosion. Managing those funds became the responsibility of the Halifax Relief Commission, a committee of community leaders and high-profile citizens in Halifax. Their primary role was to figure out how to best use this money to help the city and the survivors recover from the disaster.
For me, this is where things get interesting. Everything up until this point has just been facts of the situation, but what happens next was a choice.
One of the most urgent tasks at hand for the Relief Commission was rehousing the survivors of the explosion. You know, the 8,000 homeless and injured people freezing in the cold that we mentioned earlier. With this in mind, the committee wasted no time to construct apartment-style shelters for the survivors. However, they're very deliberate with how they went about this task. The committee made it very clear that the shelters were only going to be temporary structures and not to be built inside the devastated area itself. So they were built on the Halifax Common.
You see, for the Relief Commission, the north end of Halifax was more than just a devastated area. It was an opportunity. In their opinion, the collapsed houses and rubble made this part of Halifax a blank slate. The last thing they wanted was for survivors to go back to this land and begin building houses willy-nilly. They wanted to rebuild with a plan.
At a council meeting just 6 days after the explosion, it was argued that the north end should be rebuilt in accordance with modern ideas of town planning and construction. So what were those modern ideas? Well, oh boy, here we go. So, at the time of the Halifax explosion, around the early 20th century, cities across North America and Europe were often miserable places to live in as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Working class people often lived in rundown apartments close to factories, regularly spewing pollutants into the air. On top of this, crowded conditions and poor sanitary practices made disease very common. These terrible living conditions got many people to start thinking about how we could design cities to become utopias, perfect communities. And one idea that was gaining a lot of momentum was something called the Garden City Movement. First brought up in 1898 by Sir Ebenezer Howard, the Garden City was an idea for a community that had a balance of industry, agriculture, and homes by design. He made these really interesting diagrams to help demonstrate this. At the center of the city, you would have institutional buildings surrounded by a park, then houses and gardens, followed by industrial uses and farmland. At its core, the Garden City movement was about organizing land uses to give people enough space, and it would later influence other city trends like garden suburbs, suburban sprawl, mass reliance on the automobile drive-thrus, and I think I'm getting a bit sidetracked here. So anyways, back in Halifax, the Relief Commission was very receptive of the ideas behind the Garden City movement. The First World War and all the people and activity that came with it had made Halifax a crowded and worn-out port city. The ideas behind the Garden City movement seemed like the right step towards making Halifax a city fit for the 20th century.
But not everyone was excited about these modern ideas of town planning, especially those affected by the explosion. A lot of people that the Relief Commission was supposed to be helping felt that they're being force-fed a new vision when they really just wanted things to go back to normal. At public hearings regarding the rebuilding effort, many complained that the Relief Commission was being high-handed.
Or in my words, pretentious, arrogant, and elitist jerks. Dr. Arthur Hawkins, a respected North End resident, eloquently put it this way: "It is unjust that this government should attempt to take money which has been contributed to those people who have lost their all and expend it for a fanciful town planning scheme. It is a blow to democracy. The people should have a chance to build the homes they want." But after all that, the federal and provincial government sided with the Relief Commission and decided to build this new modern town. So who did they hire to do this? Well, these guys. Thomas Adams, a highly respected town planner, the president of the Institute of Landscape Architects, the secretary of the Garden City Association, a founding member of the British Town Planning Institute. Wow, that's a lot. And George Ross, a head architect from a Montreal firm. He was well regarded in his field and had a hand in designing buildings such as the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa and the Dominion Square building in Montreal. He also strongly believed that affordable housing shouldn't sacrifice architectural quality. Not bad. Now, Thomas Adams created plans for all of the devastated area, but for this new model community, he chose this site here. At the time, the area was known as Merkel's Field. Yeah, not the sexiest name ever, but if you look at a map assessing the damage of the explosion, you can see that this area had avoided the worst of the devastation because it was protected behind Fort Needham's hill. Everything on the other side of the hill had pretty much been wiped out. For Thomas Adams, that made Merkel's Field a perfect location for the new community. It was located in the north end, but would still be protected if there happened to be a Halifax Explosion Part 2.
With that, Thomas Adams went to work designing the street blocks, deciding what would go where, and more or less what the north end of Halifax would look like. It wasn't a textbook version of a garden city, but he did incorporate a lot of its values, creating grassy boulevards between homes, mixing housing types, and having businesses nearby on Yonge Street. It had everything you would ever need, all within a comfortable walking distance: shops, restaurants, offices, Starbucks, the works. Well, maybe not Starbucks. Then, George Ross designed the buildings. All in all, 328 dwellings, 15 stores, and 3 offices were built. The new buildings were constructed from a material known as Hydrostone.
Hydrostone is basically cement mixed with crushed granite that has been compressed into one big block. If bricks are like Lego, Hydrostone is kind of like mega blocks. It required less equipment and labor than other materials, which you can imagine was a big selling point to the Relief Commission. But most importantly, Hydrostone was fireproof, and for a community that had just seen thousands of wooden homes destroyed by an explosion, this was kind of a big deal. Hydrostone was also locally made. The blocks were formed out in Eastern Passage and taken by barge to the base of Russell Street. There was one little problem though. The vertical streets at the time made it near impossible to haul the heavy blocks of Hydrostone up the steep hill. For Thomas Adams, the answer was pretty simple. He added a diagonal street, Devonshire Avenue, to make the uphill climb a bit easier. After this, construction was relatively quick, and by the mid-1920s, the Hydrostone district had been completed and were providing homes for nearly 2,000 survivors of the Halifax explosion. Now, this project didn't come cheap, and to top it off, the Relief Committee was also responsible for paying the pensions of the survivors of the Halifax explosion. With this in mind, they decided that the best way to manage those costs would be to charge rent for the Hydrostone district.
This worked well for the Relief Commission, but it didn't work so well for the people who had lived there before. Remember those people who had been pissed off at the Relief Commission? Well, this made them furious. Many were homeowners before the explosion and felt that it was unfair that they would now have to pay rent.
The Relief Commission's response was basically take it or leave it. The people displaced by the explosion were given 2 options. They could rent in the newly constructed Hydrostone, or take a small settlement and rebuild somehow.
For the rest of the city, the Hydrostone neighborhood began to set a new standard of living in Halifax. When completed, the community contained paved streets, new curbs, gutters, catch pits, sewer, water, and electrical services. Now, that might not seem all that exciting, but remember, this was the early 1900s. Few of these services really existed at the time in Halifax. Having all these amenities available at the Hydrostone really helped build the case to expand these services to other parts of the city. The houses were a big hit as well. In fact, the building designs were so popular that George Ross's firm was hired to design homes all over the city, even all the way out in Dartmouth. In the years following the Hydrostone project, his firm was hired to design another 700 homes across the city.
But even after all this, not everything was rainbows and sunshine for the Hydrostone area.
During the Great Depression, many of the tenants could no longer afford rents, but the Halifax Commission was unwilling to lower them, and that resulted in the eviction of 152 households, almost half of all the tenants in the Hydrostone. Then in 1949, the Relief Commission began to sell the homes, and while existing tenants were given first dibs at the start, again, those that could not afford the properties found themselves at risk of eviction.
Even later in its history, the Hydrostone may have seen rougher times. There's not much documented about the neighborhood after its construction, but this one news article mentions that the Hydrostone market would have been close to a developer's idea of Skid Row in the 1980s. Photographs from around this time seem to confirm this, showing boarded-up windows and worn-out exteriors for the buildings. In fact, the Hydrostone market that we know and love today came largely after a developer bought and renovated the buildings in the mid-1990s, with the intention to restore the market to its historical roots and make the place more of a retail theater. With all that being said, Today, 100 years after the explosion, the Hydrostone district continues to be an influential neighborhood in the city. It's a sought-after location for homebuyers. The design of the Hydrostone buildings is still inspiring new developments in this area, and many advertise this Hydrostone living thing, whatever that is. By most accounts, I'd say it's been a huge success.
That being said, I can't help but think that the Hydrostone has a mixed legacy.
When you see the process of how it was built, it seems like the Hydrostone was developed without really considering what the survivors of the explosion were asking for, which was for things to go back to normal. Instead, they sought to build a planner's paradise.
For me, this is an uncomfortable narrative and one that's all too familiar. Urban planning decisions often get made without much consultation with the people that they directly impact.
In the Hydrostone's case, perhaps we ended up with a masterpiece of good community design, but that same process has been used to create the Cogswell Interchange and even the eviction of the entire community of Africville.
That being said, I think the Hydrostone district is a fascinating case of finding the silver lining. It's not every day that the city gets to design a neighborhood from scratch, but the Halifax Explosion gave them the opportunity to do so. The relief committee certainly wasn't perfect, but in the midst of one of the most horrific events in Halifax's history, they took on the enormous task of rebuilding an entire neighborhood in Halifax with ambition, focus, and an eye for design.